Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. I want to welcome you to this issue briefing, The Power of People, Co-Designing Impact and Inclusion. I want to note that it is being live streamed, so please use the hashtag for the meeting WEF22. Okay, so let's get started. You know, a point of moderator privilege. I was having dinner the other night with an amazing social entrepreneur that I work with, and my name is Cheryl Dorsey. I'm president of Echoing Green. We're a social innovation organization. And this incredible young woman, Elizabeth Hausler, who founded a social enterprise called Build Change, which changes building practices in earthquake-prone regions. And she just walked in by engaging citizen voice and ensuring that earthquake-resistant housing practices become the norm. And, you know, Elizabeth, you talk so eloquently about the importance of decision equity. And so for me, that's what we're here to talk about today. Decision equity. And we're very fortunate because we've got three extraordinary speakers to talk more about that and the importance of stakeholder inclusion. So I'm going to quickly introduce, and then we're going to just jump right in because we don't have a lot of time. So directly to my left, Pam Chan. She is Global Head and CIO, Chief Investment Officer of Alternative Solutions Group, BlackRock. Next to her, we've got Jada McKenna, CEO, Mercy Corps. And then directly next to her, we have Kahea Pacheco, Co-Director of Women's Earth Alliance. If we're really lucky, we're going to get through 2 rounds of dialogue before opening for questions. Okay, so we're going to jump right in. And Jada, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you because one of the issues that top of mind is the Ukraine crisis, just sending shockwaves around the globe. You all are right in there, and you are on the front lines, and you're ensuring that decision-making power rests with the most affected populations. Can you talk through what you are doing now as an illustration for what we mean by inclusive decision-making?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, we are on the ground in Ukraine, and one of the key things we bring in humanitarian situations is cash and the ability to do cash programming and to provide people with cash over in favor of cash over giving them food or whatever, or like used goods. You know, people deserve the dignity to make their own choices when something happens. It's also really important to stimulate local economies and to kind of keep markets and systems functioning in the midst of things where you can. Obviously, when that's not available, then we come with goods. But in that process of doing cash and working with people and getting to know people, and then in some cases where it's e-cash, like tracking the types of services they use and really need, that also helps us then do more partnerships. So we also have a lot of partnerships with Ukrainian, Polish, and Romanian civil society actors, and we're always looking to help the people who are being left behind. So in the early days of the Ukraine crisis, we were in Poland watching people come off, right? And we'd see people surge to people that looked like a typical Ukrainian. And then we saw Africans or other third country nationals being left behind. And we quickly, we started talking to them, quickly partnered with a Polish organization that could get them housing and shelter and other things. But it really starts with those communications tools for us. The other thing we have is we've designed this tool called Signpost, and it's something we co-created with the IRC. And in emergency situations, it provides kind of trusted information to people, but it's a two-way, like it's actually an interaction where a person can ask for specific things or tell specific things. So those are all points of feedback for us. And then as we do longer term planning, we really try to work with local organizations and local governments to talk about what they need to build for resilient, or what support they will need to plan for these shocks, because the people that help each other in emergencies are usually your neighbors, right? And so really trying to work and figure out what systems need, what we can support, what we don't know, right? And what we can learn from systems where we're working locally. But it just has to be a two-way conversation, and you're never inclusive enough. Like, you just always have to be striving to do more.
I really like that, never inclusive enough. You're on a journey.
Yes,
and I like this trust-based partnership. And I'm going to loop back to you in a second after I ask Kahea a question. We know that Women's Earth Alliance has a really long history of community partnerships with women-led, community-based organizations, really working to scale environmental and climate impact. Can you sort of talk about some of your learnings doing this work, Kahea?
Yeah, of course. I loved all the work that you all are doing, so thank you for that. But one of the big learnings I think that we've seen over the years, and that I think more people need to be aware of, especially as companies are beginning to work more and more on things like reforestation and forest protection and these kind of nature-based solutions for climate, is that we have to be looking at consultation as not just a check mark. Like, it can't really be consultation. It has to be collaboration. It has to be these deep partnerships. I was in conversation with someone earlier today, and they mentioned radical inclusion. And I looked it up because I was like, what is this radical inclusion? And for me, that's just common sense inclusion. It really is working with those who are most affected, because they will know the best solutions for their communities. These are grassroots solutions. These are why grassroots solutions have been shown to work. When we come in imposing state and corporate centered approaches ahead of grassroots solutions, that's where things fall apart, because you don't have, to put it in kind of corporate speak, you don't have stakeholder buy-in. You don't have community buy-in, is a better way of putting it. The community is not involved in it. They're not implementation partners. They don't see how this is going to benefit their health, their sustainable livelihoods, their connection to their environment. And I think one of the reasons we do that when we're talking about equity and decision making, I think one of the reasons we do that is that we don't value community-based knowledge. We don't value traditional ecological knowledge on the same level as we do scientific and other Western ways of knowing. Which, when you're dealing with things like environmental destruction and climate change, is a little bit alarming, because traditional ecological knowledge is so far the only thing that has sustainably stewarded our Earth for as many years. When we stopped basing our approaches on traditional ecological knowledge, when we disconnected from that relationship, that's when the Industrial Revolution happened. That's when things started going down this downhill path that we currently find ourselves on. And the last piece, I think, learning that obviously as Women's Earth Alliance, we center is having a gendered lens in all you do. Women are often the shock absorbers of all forms of crises in their communities. They are on the front lines because they are those who are most impacted, because they often are those tasked with caring for children, caring for elders, providing clean water, providing food, finding energy for their families. Because of all of those things, they are best positioned to know what solutions will actually work in their communities.
I so love that. Someone recently shared a stat that women were like 14 times more likely to die during climate and other natural disasters, right on the front lines of that gendered lens. And I so appreciate you talking about the power of language, radical inclusion, as Elizabeth said, decision equity. And it reminds me of Brian Stevenson, who sort of ascribed value by talking about proximity, right? So all of these things that you all are raising up and doing your work. And it does get to the question of power, Pam. When we talk about stakeholders, we often look to, businesses, key stakeholders. Can you really talk to us from your perspective as a business leader about the value of partnership and active engagement from your perch as a corporate leader?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, and at least my work on the impact investing side is centered on the U.S., so my comments will be kind of more focused there. But one of the things that we recognize, and we had a lot of conversation internally, is that we don't know, right, what is going to generate the most long-standing impact. And we actually need to engage, not just a one-time consultation, but it actually is a joint collaboration. So as we think about investing in undercapitalized communities of color in the U.S., one of the things that we said was, we're actually going to have a flexible remit from an investment perspective. So we can invest equity, but we also know that equity can be dilutive to minority business owners. So sometimes equity is not the right answer. Right. Could be credit, could be an asset-based thing, could be developing an infrastructure project in the particular majority-minority census tract, could be real estate, debt and equity, right? So actually bring to bear, in some sense, the breadth of what we have, and then focus it on a really specific thing, which for us in this instance is accelerating positive economic outcomes for communities of color in the U.S., right? But in order to do that, we actually need to first engage with those communities, which are, by the way, not monolithic at all, right? If we think about the Black, Latino, Native American communities in the U.S., and then also across the country, right? Alaska, very different than Alabama. And even therein, differences, right? And so when we think about investing, one of the things that we're looking for is a couple things. One is businesses that think about the community, right? So we actually talked to a real estate company recently, and one of the things that they described was actually engaging community leaders as the property managers for those buildings that we're building, right? So they are pastors, they are small business owners, et cetera. So they are aligned with us to get the community to a better place, right? Which is also good for us from an investment perspective. And I think this is how the type of, you build an ecosystem, right? So it's not just a one-time investment, but how do you actually get everybody working together toward the same outcome? And I think that's actually how you also get great returns, which is what I ultimately need to deliver to the clients for whom I manage money. So
I appreciate that, and I'll just sort of plus one this notion of sort of founder first, entrepreneur first capital. Love that you guys are doing that, and this notion that there are these intermediate actors and communities that sit between you all, sort of rooftops versus grassroots, and sort of building an ecosystem, I think is a really important and valuable lesson. So thanks for that, Pam. All right, I'm going to go back now, and Jada, I mean, you're such a well-known and well-respected global leader who sort of sees across so many countries on so many issues, and so much of your work has to happen through sort of a decolonial frame. And I'd love for you to give us an example. I know some of the interesting work you're doing, like in Nigeria. How do you navigate that where you have these sort of structural, historical barriers that make it complicated?
Yeah, I think for us and for our team, I'm always talking about power dynamics. In our sector, right, there's the decolonization, localization. We don't have good words for it. And some of my peers really stop at like sub-granting as though, okay, just passing on money is the solution. And I'm like, no, this is about really understanding fundamental power structures and making sure, you know, where, and so when we're thinking about our strategy and where we go, I'm like, where are we best positioned as an international NGO to serve and to collaborate? What are the areas that we should seed? Where are the places where other people should naturally lead? And like, what do we bring that's unique to the environment? And how do we do that in a way that is a shared power and an inclusive power and not, so I think, you know, people, they come into this line of work and it's like, we want to do good for the world and I'm going to go save. And they don't realize right there is like this power dynamic at work as though like I have the answer to go save. Some people have to save themselves. And so, and it's every part of our DNA, you know, we're looking at our name and like, you know, it represents a dynamic that's not very, you know, Mercy Corps implies a lot of things that we are not about mentally. And we don't think that we're providing mercy in the world. So, really working, and for us when it comes to who we work with in society, and thank you for all the comments on women. I could go on, I'll leave them there, but also think about like local private sector actors, local civil society. It's not just like a local government. It's really being in communities, trying to figure out how to get to the most marginalized. And for us, that's a lot of work with small entrepreneurs, also bringing products and services in to help the communities we care about. In Nigeria, we work with an organization called Solar Sisters, that sells and provides clean cook stoves through a women-only workforce, right? And so, you know, making sure women have those kinds of economic opportunities in situations that they will feel safe being in and that suit the needs of their households as well. And so, like, where we can kind of invest and support those efforts. But, you know, so for us, it's thinking about everything from name change to what our staff looks like, to who we're working with, and to like, you know, really questioning everything that we decide to do when we decide to go after funding. Like, are we the best suited for this? And what does that mean? And who else needs to be here? And I'm sure it's a lot of, we've changed our language a lot. A lot of the language of, you know, like field or chief of party all comes from this very like militaristic, or the field is some like foreign place I'm going, you know.
Exactly.
And so just point. Like even our language, our advertising, you will not see, you know, the pictures that I grew up with in the 80s of like the flies and the kids. You will see people in positions of strength, like leading their own futures when you look at Mercy Corps advertising. And I know there's a bunch of stuff that we are still blind to and not doing well, and it's a journey. And we are humbly just at the very beginning scratching the surface, I think.
That was incredible, and I thank you for being really specific and pointing out examples. And Kaya, would you pick up on that? Like, what are some of these common pitfalls that you see when people have good intentions, but it's falling short in terms of its intended impact? So if you could expound, that would be great.
Yeah, I think overall it's a lack of understanding of the investment it takes really to do this work well, to be inclusive. Not only is it an investment in money, it's an investment of time. These are relationships, and like all relationships, they take time. As a company, you have to invest time as well as money, as well as wraparound support. Oftentimes in the work we're doing with women leaders, all of our capacity building work will include sustainable livelihood development. Much like Solar Sisters, actually, we're very familiar with their work, but ensuring that the women leaders we work with, if they are working to, for example, stop logging on a forest so they can protect the forest and do reforesting work, we need to provide women and the community with a sustainable livelihood development alternative. And that might be tree nurseries so they can sell firewood, which is the biggest cause of deforestation across many parts of Africa. So I think it's acknowledging the investment it takes of time, money, and wraparound support, and acknowledging that if, as an entity, as a company organization, you are not in the position to offer that kind of support, there are organizations that can. This is something that, for example, WIA does. We have 16 years worth of a track record of doing this kind of wraparound support, and we partner with companies all the time to work on these kinds of issues, to move the needle on climate through grassroots solutions. Another thing I think is one of the pitfalls is that we need to stop seeing communities as an afterthought. Over the past few days, I've heard a lot about partnerships between companies, partnerships between states and companies. I haven't heard as much about partnerships with communities or partnerships at a grassroots level. And I think that's lacking. And I think we also have to, I think that is a symptom of the fact that we are continuing to think of communities as just those who are most severely impacted by whatever crises we're facing. So they're the ones we're going to help, much like the savior complex thing you were alluding to. And also just as the beneficiaries of the good work we're going to do in the world. I think those speak to that power dynamic. And instead we have to shift to recognizing that communities are solutionaries. They know what is best, and they could just use partnership, meaningful, authentic, deep partnership.
It's so beautifully said in what you were saying, and I appreciate you with that call to action to shift from a deficit-based to an asset-based framing. You're exactly right. So thank you for sharing that. One more question to you, Pam, and then we're going to open it up for questions. Can you talk to us about all the work you're doing around sort of driving economic outcomes for marginalized communities, while, as you said, trying to balance the imperative for market returns? I mean, again, how do you practically think through that?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to pick up on solutionaries, which I really like. I think the community needs to be the agent, right, for the change and for the impact. And so what we're finding, so for instance, we're making an investment in Florida and Texas where we're addressing what we're calling fitness deserts. So everybody talks about food deserts, right? But fitness deserts, as we think about social determinants of health in Black and brown communities in those two states. And one of the things that was really critical to us is actually having so we're rolling out a bunch of locations to do like both not just physical fitness, but also mental health, nutrition, meditation, like holistic well-being. And the element that I'm most excited about is that for each of these locations, we're actually going to bring in, the franchise owner is going to be someone from the community. And they're also going to own a part in the holding company, right? And so they become a small business owner that's actually going to get people to come in, work out, break a sweat, have a smoothie, leave, right? And hopefully also address, as we think about obesity, diabetes, heart disease within, frankly, communities of color, which has, I mean, when you look at the statistics, it is staggering. And one of the other elements of this is actually having, in this instance, the state of Florida actually also lean in, because they are well aligned with us, because they don't want as many people suffering from obesity and all the other health conditions that I just described. And so really bringing it together, but I think it starts with actually the person who's at the check-in desk at the location, right? To get those people to come in and actually work out. And I think that that is a really powerful thing. Like if I went there and I just started like moonlighting, I don't think it would have that same impact, right? But that general manager is really going to get the community excited.
Yes.
And I think that's going to result in ultimately us doing well and doing good. So I definitely appreciate the fact that we need to start with the community first. You need to understand by listening, frankly. Just listening, right? The whole like pontificating and the savior thing that you described, I think there's frankly nothing more off-putting.
I couldn't agree more.
But we have a lot of resources and capabilities that we can bring. But the community knowledge, that we don't have, right? So that's what we're trying to glean.
And it's a real-time example of stakeholder inclusion. And I'm thinking as you're talking, Pam, I'm going to introduce you to two extraordinary social entrepreneurs, Vanessa Garrison and Morgan Dixon, who started Girl Trek, which is now the largest public health organization that are getting Black women to walk in the United States. Their goal is to get to 1 million women. And they're recognizing that some of those folks, and that probably me at one point, I'm like not going in there to mess up my hair. I'm not going in there to do something for an hour, but I can walk for 30 minutes. So how do we sort of make sure that you're talking to them and the thousands and hundreds of thousands of women that they're mobilizing? So we'll make that happen. All right, I know folks want to take advantage of this level of expertise. Can we pass around the mic, and please, when you stand up, introduce yourself and then ask your question to the panelists. I see this gentleman has his hand up.
Hello, my name is Sikandar Bizinjo. I am a global shaper from Karachi Hub in Pakistan. We are working in the rural communities of Balochistan province, mainly involving communities. And how we work is the fact that the communities are empowered. They take the lead themselves. We just identify the areas where we can help as part of the resources and capacity building. One of the projects that we are doing is helping them build reading rooms in villages that do not have internet. So they identify an abandoned building, an abandoned room, turn it into a library with limited resources. We don't have any funding. We don't use any monetary funding as well. It's all community support. And then we call for donations from different people, and then we send these books to them. So in such an informal way of work, when you invest in social entrepreneurship, for instance, what do you look for? For example, someone like me who has no business background, for instance, I don't know how to make it a sustainable way. It's just community support in a very informal way. So if you want to invest in something like this, what would be your advice to us to make it even better?
Yeah. So thank you for the question, by the way, and for the work that you're doing. Sounds incredible. I think maybe one piece of advice, because I've talked to a bunch of social entrepreneurs, is help me think about how this scales. Right? So how can the capital that we invest get the thing that you're doing to scale? And what are the milestones that will help accelerate, and what are the headwinds that will push you back, right? If you bring me on that journey of those things, I think that's very helpful. The other element is, why is it that impact, i.e. the doing good, is also aligned with generating return on that investment, right? And I think we oftentimes don't talk about that enough early on, right? It's all about the doing good, which, by the way, given where I sit, I am obviously very partial toward, right? But I also know that my fiduciary duty is to my clients, right? And they have both philanthropic programs as well as those that are more market return seeking. And I'm in the latter category. And frankly, I think that if we can develop more and more proof points in that second category, there'll be less skepticism about doing things that actually do good. But actually starting the conversation with that, even though sometimes talking about financial metrics seems like you've missed just assume that I'm there with you on the doing good, and let's focus in on the nitty-gritty of how you actually align the economic and the impact objective.
We got to hear from Jada and Kahea, two top civil society leaders who are going to also add to that. Please, I would love to hear from you both on that.
Yeah, the other piece to that too is even within communities, there are just always people that are still left behind in those communities, and so the ways making sure or working with the communities to figure out how to make sure that it's really full access, or that everyone opens up. I think the other thing we look at a lot too when we decide to partner with, we actually have our own very small, modest social ventures fund, but we also are looking at unintended consequences and really making sure that people are looking at, like, is what you're doing have the impact that you think it is? And is it causing other things? So a lot of my career in this space has been in the food security sector. And at one point, there was development, I think, the golden rice, the vitamin A enhanced rice. But they didn't know who their customer was. Their customer for that was women, right? And so the original product, like, took longer to cook and wasn't a variety that their families liked. And so, so just being very aware of those things as well. But that also gets to the path of scaling and pulling it together.
Okay.
Yeah. Our work is actually more aligned with yours in that there isn't often a clear way to get an ROI out of it, I think. And we've focused on doing things like seed banks, developing seed banks with our women leaders so that in building that climate resilience through climate resilient seeds, they can also then grow food to sell at market. So creating a space within the framework of what you're building that the community itself is able to monetize so that there's not a need to kind of base things on an ROI, because that's not often a clear pathway if you're working on just straight community-based work like this.
Great, got some good advice. And I would say check out Global Fund for Children. It's an extraordinary group, intermediary, that invests in proximate organizations. So I think they'd be interested in taking a look at what you're doing. Any other questions for our esteemed panelists? Yes, Elizabeth. Oh, background. There you go.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Cheryl, for that call out. So Cheryl and Echoing Green were Build Change's very first funder. I'm not sure I would have gone down this path if it wasn't for you. Thank you. So while I was traveling here over the weekend, I was reading the New York Times series of articles on the reparations that Haiti was forced to pay France after slavery ended, and then the ongoing imposition of debt by force, and then the Wall Street-backed U.S. invasion of Haiti. How do we even open the conversation here at Davos with our partners in the private sector about making that right?
Oh, so appreciate that question. Hey, I'm going to start with you, and let's
thank you.
Yeah,
That is not an easy one.
I think we just have to be okay with having the tough conversation. It's not always easy for organizations to talk with their partners, for example, about divesting in extractive industry. That's a very tough conversation to have. That's littered with power dynamics and inequity and people's lives. From an Indigenous perspective, that's littered with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And frankly, at some point, you just have to be willing to have that tough conversation, to look them in the eye and say, this isn't right. And I know that might sound idealistic, but there's certain things and certain injustices that shouldn't be tiptoed around, that we should just call out for the injustice that it is.
Hear, hear. Jada?
The impacts, it's just a heartbreaking series of articles to read, and a heartbreaking situation that we've known about, but to see it quantified in that way. And Haiti continues to struggle. I think there does need to be some coalition of people that are actually work with Haitians for them to lead these conversations and to lead these demands, and gives them the space to take the lead, and whether organizations like ours or people in this room are the intermediaries that help. Okay, this is how you put pressure on this Western company here or there, and really talk through them about what they need. And it really's got to start with the citizens of Haiti. It can't be a government conversation. It can't be. It's really got to start with the people.
Pam, anything to add on that note?
I don't think so.
It's a tough one. Look, it's interesting where, again, language matters. We talk about aid, but it's really repair and reparations, right? And sort of the shift. I heard two incredible Black women scholars who study the development marketplace, and they talked about how ahistoric the field is. And that's what happens when you get there. And I know, again, Kahea and Jada will know better than I ever will. Years ago, where proximate leaders said development aid isn't coming to us. We're only getting about 3.5% of aid getting to local actors. And they set up this, grand bargain where they were going to try to get 20% of development dollars to these local actors. Was it 5 years later? It went down to 2%. So these are how entrenched and difficult these conversations are, this hold on power and resources. but you just got to start. You got to tell the story, and you got to start talking about it. But it is really, really hard. We got to wrap, and not enough time. It's just sort of, it's miserable, really. We just got to scratch the surface with you extraordinary women. So I just want to thank each of you. Kahea, Jada, Pam, thank you for your comments. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming.